Welcome, true believers, to a journey through more than 60 years of one of comics' most complex and enduring villains. Tonight, we're going to explore the complete story of Victor Von Doom, from his tragic origins in the war-torn nation of Latveria, all the way through to his modern role as both tyrant and reluctant hero. This is a tale that spans decades of publication, countless dimensions, and the very soul of a man who would be both destroyer and savior of worlds. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift as we walk together through the iron halls of Castle Doom and beyond. We'll move slowly and steadily through each era, each creative team, each moment that shaped Marvel's most compelling antagonist. There's no rush here. No need to memorize every plot detail. Just let the story wash over you like the mountain mists of Latveria that shrouded young Victor's childhood. Our story begins not in the gleaming towers of New York or the cosmic reaches of space, but in a small Romani camp nestled in the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains, in a land that would one day be called Latveria. It was the early 1920s, a time when Europe was still healing from the wounds of the Great War, when ancient prejudices ran deeper than national borders, and when a brilliant child could be born into circumstances that would shape him into either humanity's greatest champion or its most dangerous enemy. The world was changing rapidly in those days, caught between the old ways of monarchy and tradition and the new possibilities of science and democracy. Into this uncertain world came Victor Von Doom, born to parents who embodied both the wisdom of the past and the hope for a better future. His father, Werner von Doom, was a healer and a leader among his people, respected for his skill with herbs and his ability to navigate the dangerous political currents that surrounded the Romani community. His mother, Cynthia von Doom, was a woman of remarkable intelligence and hidden depths, whose love for her family was matched only by her desperate desire to protect them from the forces that threatened their simple life. She possessed abilities that went beyond the mundane, gifts that in another time and place might have made her a celebrated sorceress, but in the superstitious world of early 20th century Europe marked her as dangerous and different. The Romani people had survived for centuries by adapting to whatever circumstances they found themselves in, by keeping their own counsel and protecting their own, by understanding that the world beyond their campfires was often hostile to those who lived by different rules. This knowledge would be passed down to young Victor along with his parents' love, shaping his understanding of how power worked and how those without it could be crushed by those who possessed it. The mountains themselves seemed to watch over Victor's early years, ancient peaks that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, that had sheltered both conquerors and refugees, that held secrets older than recorded history. The castle that would one day become his fortress already stood on those heights, though in those days it belonged to Baron von Ruthven, a cruel nobleman whose family had oppressed the people of the region for generations. Victor's childhood was marked by moments of profound joy and terrible sorrow, experiences that would echo through his entire life and influence every decision he would make as a man. His father's medical practice brought him into contact with people from all walks of life, teaching young Victor that suffering was universal, but that knowledge and skill could alleviate it. His mother's evening stories filled his imagination with tales of magic and wonder, of powers that could reshape reality itself if one had the wisdom and courage to wield them. But it was the contrast between his family's love and the world's cruelty that would prove most formative. Victor learned early that intelligence and moral worth meant nothing if you lacked the power to protect what you cherished. He watched his father treat patients who could not pay, saw his mother share what little they had with families even poorer than their own, and witnessed how their generosity was often repaid with suspicion and persecution. The political situation in the region was growing more unstable as Victor grew from child to young man. The old Austro-Hungarian Empire had collapsed, leaving a patchwork of new nations struggling to define themselves and their borders. Local strongmen and foreign powers competed for influence, while ordinary people caught in the middle paid the price for their ambitions and miscalculations. Baron von Ruthven's rule over the region was becoming more oppressive with each passing year, as economic pressures and political uncertainty made him more paranoid and cruel. The Romani camps were easy targets for his frustrations, communities that could be blamed for any misfortune and exploited without consequence. The Baron's soldiers would sweep through the settlements regularly, demanding tribute, conscripting young men and making it clear that the lives of the camp dwellers were worth less than nothing in the eyes of the law. It was during one of these raids that Victor first truly understood the relationship between power and justice. He was perhaps 10 years old when the Baron's men came looking for someone to blame for a series of failed harvests, and they decided that the Romani must have cursed the land with their presence. The soldiers destroyed crops, scattered livestock, and beat anyone who dared to protest their actions. Victor watched his father try to reason with the soldiers, explaining that his people were healers and helpers, not enemies of the local farmers. He saw his mother use her abilities to try to calm the situation, weaving subtle influences that might have made violent men more reasonable, but reason and magic alike proved insufficient against armored brutality and institutional prejudice. He saw his mother use her abilities to try to calm the situation, weaving subtle influences. Umsitsby, Sowodme Sprasty, Suaplets Beesan and Teats, Pelets Peasan and Diffury. Suaplets 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 Peasan and Diffury. The raid continued, families were displaced, and several people were seriously injured before the soldiers finally withdrew. That night, as his parents tended to the wounded and tried to restore some order to their shattered community, Victor made a decision that would echo through the rest of his life. He swore that he would never again be helpless in the face of injustice, that he would acquire whatever power was necessary to protect those he cared about, and that those who used their strength to oppress the weak would one day answer to him for their crimes. The seeds of both heroism and tyranny were planted in that moment, as a brilliant child's natural empathy was twisted by his understanding of how the world actually worked. Victor's desire to protect the innocent was genuine and would never entirely fade, but his methods for achieving that protection would be shaped by the lesson that mercy was a luxury only the powerful could afford. As Victor entered adolescence, his remarkable intelligence began to manifest in ways that amazed and sometimes frightened those around him. He absorbed his father's medical knowledge with supernatural speed, mastering in months what took others years to learn. He listened to his mother's mystical teachings with an intensity that worried her, asking questions that revealed an understanding of magical principles that went far beyond his years. But most remarkably, Victor began to demonstrate an intuitive grasp of mechanical and scientific principles that seemed to come from nowhere. He would examine the Baron's soldiers' weapons and armor with the eye of an engineer, mentally cataloging their strengths and weaknesses. He studied the construction techniques used in the local buildings, understanding instinctively how improvements could be made. He even began to sketch designs for devices that wouldn't be invented for decades, though he lacked the resources and materials to build them. This combination of scientific genius, mystical heritage, and burning ambition made Victor a unique figure in his small world, but it also made him dangerous in ways that even he didn't fully understand. The Baron's informants began to report strange stories about the Romani boy who seemed to know too much, who asked uncomfortable questions, and who looked at the established order with eyes that promised future upheaval. The crisis that would reshape Victor's life forever began with his mother's growing desperation to protect her family from the increasingly dangerous political situation. Cynthia von Doom had always been careful to keep her magical abilities hidden from outsiders, understanding that such gifts would make her a target for both those who would exploit her and those who would destroy her. But as the Baron's persecution of the Romani intensified, she began to consider more drastic measures. The ancient texts that had been passed down through her family spoke of powers that could reshape reality itself, abilities that could make the weak strong and the oppressed into oppressors. But they also warned of prices that had to be paid, of bargains that seemed beneficial but carried costs that might not be apparent for years or even generations. Cynthia had always been wise enough to avoid such temptations, but wisdom is often the first casualty of desperation. The specific incident that drove her to take such risks was the Baron's decision to conscript all the young men from the Romani camps for his personal army, effectively enslaving an entire generation to serve in his petty wars with neighboring nobles. Cynthia's of Orleans, Toise of neighboring nobles. Victor was still too young for conscription, but his father and older cousins were not, and Cynthia could see her family being torn apart by forces beyond their control. Late one night, while Victor slept and Werner was away treating a patient in a distant village, Cynthia opened the forbidden texts and began to study spells that she had always sworn she would never use. These were not the gentle influences and healing magics that she had practiced all her life, but darker workings that drew power from sources that demanded payment in spiritual currency. The entity that responded to her desperate summons was ancient and patient, a being that had been making similar bargains with desperate humans for millennia. Mephisto, as he was known to those foolish enough to traffic with him, appeared to Cynthia in the form of a distinguished gentleman, offering her exactly what she needed most: the power to protect her family and her people from the Baron's oppression. The terms seemed reasonable at first hearing. Cynthia would gain the ability to influence the minds of the Baron and his soldiers to turn their cruelty into compassion and their persecution into protection. Her people would be safe, her family would remain together, and the price would be paid not by her but by her descendants at some unspecified future time when they were strong enough to bear the cost without being destroyed by it. Mephisto was careful not to lie to her outright, but he also made sure that she understood only what she needed to understand to make the bargain. The power he offered was real, the protection it would provide was genuine, and the delay in payment was exactly as described. What he didn't explain was the nature of the price that would eventually be demanded, or the way that making such a bargain would corrupt even the most noble intentions. Cynthia accepted the deal because she felt she had no choice, and because her love for her family blinded her to the long-term consequences of trafficking with forces beyond human understanding. The power flowed into her immediately, and she used it exactly as she had promised, weaving subtle influences that gradually changed the Baron's attitude toward the Romani camps from hostile persecution to benign neglect. The results were everything she had hoped for and more. The raids stopped, the conscription orders were quietly rescinded, and her people were allowed to live their lives in relative peace and security. Werner returned from his medical rounds to find their community transformed, though Cynthia was careful not to explain exactly how the change had come about. She simply told him that their prayers had been answered, and for a time it seemed that this might be true. Victor was old enough to notice the change in his mother, though he couldn't have understood what it meant. She seemed more confident and more powerful, but also more distant and troubled. She would spend long hours staring into the fire, lost in thoughts that she couldn't or wouldn't share. Sometimes he would catch her looking at him with an expression of such profound sadness that it broke his heart, though she would always smile and reassure him when she noticed his concern. The years that followed were among the happiest of Victor's young life. Free from the constant threat of persecution, he was able to focus on his studies and his growing understanding of both science and magic. His father taught him everything he knew about medicine and healing, while his mother shared the safer aspects of her mystical knowledge. Most importantly, both parents made sure that he understood the values that should guide anyone who possessed power over others: compassion, justice, and the protection of those who could not protect themselves. But even during this peaceful interlude, Victor was beginning to understand that the world beyond his family's influence remained dangerous and unjust. He would travel with his father to treat patients in other regions, and he saw how the strong continued to prey upon the weak, how knowledge and wisdom were subordinated to brute force and political cunning. These experiences reinforced his determination to acquire whatever power was necessary to change such a system, though he still believed that such power could be used benevolently. The Baron's protection, purchased with his mother's bargain, extended only so far and lasted only so long. As Victor approached his 16th birthday, political changes beyond even Mephisto's influence began to threaten the fragile peace that had sheltered his adolescence. A new player was emerging on the European stage, a charismatic leader in Germany who promised to restore order and strength to a continent still struggling with the aftermath of the Great War. Adolf Hitler's rise to power sent ripples of change throughout Eastern Europe, as local strongmen tried to position themselves to benefit from the new regime's expansion. Baron von Ruthven saw an opportunity to increase his own power by aligning himself with the Nazis, offering his territory as a staging ground for operations in the Balkans. This alliance required him to demonstrate his commitment to the new ideology, including its racial theories and persecution of minority groups. The Romani camps that had enjoyed protection under Cynthia's magical influence suddenly found themselves targeted not just by local prejudice, but by the systematic machinery of genocide that was beginning to spread across Nazi-occupied Europe. The Baron's new German advisors made it clear that tolerance for undesirable elements was no longer politically acceptable, and that decisive action would be required to prove his loyalty to the new order. Cynthia felt the change coming like a storm on the horizon, a shift in the cosmic balance that threatened to overwhelm the protections she had woven around her people. She tried to strengthen her magical defenses to extend the influence that had kept them safe for so long, but she discovered that her power was no longer sufficient to the task. The forces arrayed against them were too strong, too numerous, and too systematic to be turned aside by individual action. It was then that Mephisto appeared to her again, offering to expand their original bargain to meet the new threat. The price would be higher this time, the payment more immediate, but he assured her that the protection he could provide would be absolute and permanent. Her family would not just survive the coming persecution, they would emerge from it stronger and more powerful than ever before. The specific terms of this second bargain were more complex and more immediately costly than the first. Cynthia would gain access to powers that could protect her entire people, but the price would be paid in part by her immediate sacrifice. She would not die, but she would be bound to Mephisto's service, her soul forfeit though her body might linger on Earth for years to come. More importantly, the debt that had been deferred in the first bargain would now fall upon her son, though not until he was strong enough to bear it and wise enough to potentially escape it. Cynthia accepted these terms because she could see no alternative that would not result in the destruction of everyone she loved. She used her enhanced powers to weave protections around the Romani camps that would make them invisible to Nazi patrols and immune to the Baron's attempts at persecution. But the cost of wielding such power while bound to Mephisto's service began to consume her almost immediately. Victor watched his mother fade over the course of several months, becoming more ethereal and distant with each passing day. She still loved him and still tried to teach him what she could, but it was clear that she was being pulled away from the mortal world by forces beyond his understanding. She tried to prepare him for what was coming, to give him the knowledge and tools he would need to protect himself and possibly free her. But she was fighting against time and against the limitations of what a teenage boy could comprehend. The end came suddenly, on a night when German patrols had been seen in the area and the entire camp was tense with fear. Cynthia gathered her family around her and tried to explain what she had done and why she had done it, though the full implications of her bargains were too complex for immediate understanding. She told Victor that he would one day have the power to set things right, but that he must be careful not to let his desire for justice blind him to the importance of mercy. Then, as dawn broke over the mountains, Cynthia von Doom simply faded away, her physical form dissolving like morning mist as her soul was claimed by the debt she had incurred. Victor was left holding empty air where his mother had been, while Werner collapsed in grief, and the entire camp mourned the loss of the woman who had protected them all. But the protections Cynthia had woven remained in place, and true to Mephisto's promise, the Nazi patrols passed by the Romani camps without seeing them. The persecution that was destroying similar communities throughout Europe never touched Victor's people, though the price paid for that protection would echo through the decades to come. Victor's grief over his mother's disappearance was complicated by his growing understanding of what she had done and what it meant for his own future. He threw himself into his studies with even greater intensity, mastering not only his father's medical knowledge and his mother's magical teachings, but also beginning to develop the scientific theories that would eventually make him one of the most brilliant inventors in human history. Werner tried to provide guidance and support for his son, but his own grief made it difficult for him to see how Victor was changing. The boy's natural empathy was being overwhelmed by his burning desire to acquire the power necessary to prevent future tragedies, and his understanding of justice was being twisted by his growing belief that the ends always justified the means when innocent lives were at stake. The first clear sign of how much Victor had changed came when Baron von Rufen, frustrated by his inability to locate and eliminate the Romani camps, decided to take hostages from the local villages to force information from the hidden communities. Among those seized was a young girl who had been treated by Werner for a childhood illness and whose family had always been kind to the Romani people. Victor learned of the girl's capture and made a decision that would have horrified his parents. Rather than trying to negotiate or seeking help from the community elders, he infiltrated the Baron's castle using a combination of stealth, cunning, and the magical abilities he had inherited from his mother. But instead of simply rescuing the girl, he systematically murdered every soldier in the castle and confronted the Baron himself. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Victor used his growing understanding of both science and magic to turn the Baron's own weapons against him, demonstrating a level of strategic thinking and ruthless efficiency that was terrifying in someone so young. When it was over, Baron von Rufen was dead, his soldiers were dead, and the girl was free. But Victor had crossed a line that would define the rest of his life. The rescue was successful, and the immediate threat was eliminated, but the methods Victor had used troubled even those who benefited from his actions. His father was horrified to learn what his son had done, not because he mourned the Baron's death, but because he recognized that Victor had chosen a path that would lead him away from the healing and protection that had been the family's traditional calling. The confrontation with his father that followed was painful for both of them, but it clarified the fundamental differences in their approaches to justice and power. Werner believed that healing and patience could eventually overcome evil, while Victor had concluded that direct action and overwhelming force were the only reliable ways to protect the innocent. Neither was entirely wrong, but their different conclusions would drive them apart just when they most needed each other's support. The death of Baron von Rufen created a power vacuum in the region that quickly attracted the attention of both Nazi officials and Soviet agents as the great powers of Europe struggled to control every piece of strategically valuable territory. The Romani camps found themselves caught between competing forces that were even more dangerous than the Baron had been, and it became clear that Victor's victory had only postponed their problems rather than solving them. It was during this chaotic period that Victor made the decision that would shape the rest of his life. He concluded that his people would never be safe until they had their own nation, their own government, and their own military to protect them. More importantly, he realized that creating such a nation would require him to acquire knowledge and resources that were far beyond what he could learn in the mountain camps of his childhood. The decision to leave his father and his people was agonizing, but Victor convinced himself that it was necessary for their long-term survival. He would go out into the world, master every form of power that could be learned or acquired, and then return to create a homeland where his people could live in safety and dignity. It was a noble goal, but the methods he chose to pursue it would gradually corrupt both his intentions and his soul. Werner tried to dissuade his son from this course, arguing that the kind of power Victor sought would inevitably change him in ways that would make him incapable of using it wisely. But Victor's mind was made up. and his growing arrogance made him dismiss his father's concerns as the weakness of an old man who didn't understand the realities of the modern world. The farewell between father and son was heartbreaking, made worse by both their awareness that they might never see each other again and their inability to bridge the philosophical gap that had opened between them. Werner gave Victor what little money the family had saved, along with his mother's mystical texts and his blessing, though it was clear that he feared what his son might become in pursuit of his goals. Victor left the mountain camps of his childhood on a cold morning in early spring 1939, just months before the German invasion of Poland would plunge Europe into its second Great War in a generation. He was 18 years old, brilliant beyond measure, and absolutely convinced that he could acquire the power necessary to reshape the world according to his vision of justice. He was also carrying burdens and debts that he didn't fully understand, inheriting both his mother's magical legacy and the price that would eventually have to be paid for the bargains she had made. The young man who walked down from the Carpathian Mountains that spring was no longer the child who had grown up in the shadow of ancient peaks and older prejudices. Victor von Doom was beginning to emerge, though he wouldn't fully understand what that transformation meant until many years later, when the price of his ambitions had been paid not just by himself but by everyone who had ever stood in his way. The journey from the mountains of Latveria to the halls of American academia was long and complex, taking Victor through a Europe that was rapidly sliding toward total war. Each step of this journey would leave its mark on the young man's developing psyche, adding layers of experience and cynicism that would eventually transform him into the figure the world would know as Dr. Doom. His first stop was Vienna, where the ancient Habsburg capital still retained much of its imperial grandeur despite the political upheavals that had shaken Central Europe since the end of the Great War. The city's libraries and universities offered Victor his first taste of truly advanced academic resources, while its cafes and salons provided opportunities to observe the kind of intellectual discourse that had shaped European thought for centuries. Vienna in 1938 was a city living on borrowed time, as the Anschluss had recently brought Austria under Nazi control, and the persecution of intellectuals and minorities was intensifying with each passing month. Victor witnessed firsthand the systematic destruction of academic freedom and the forced emigration of some of Europe's greatest minds, experiences that reinforced his growing conviction that only absolute power could protect the things that mattered most. The young man who had grown up in the relative isolation of the Carpathian Mountains was exposed for the first time to the full scope of human civilization's achievements and failures. He spent long hours in the Imperial Library, absorbing works of philosophy, science, and mysticism that had been collected over centuries of Habsburg rule. But he also walked the streets where Jewish shops were being vandalized and intellectuals were being arrested, seeing how quickly the accumulated wisdom of generations could be swept away by organized hatred and political opportunism. Victor's time in Vienna was cut short by the increasing danger posed by his Romani heritage and his outspoken criticism of the Nazi regime's racial policies. The network of underground contacts that his father had established during his medical practice proved invaluable in helping Victor obtain the documents and connections necessary to continue his journey westward. But the experience of being hunted and persecuted left deep scars on his already wounded psyche. From Vienna, Victor made his way to Budapest, where he used his father's reputation and his own emerging abilities to gain access to the city's libraries and laboratories. The Hungarian capital in 1939 was a cosmopolitan center of learning and culture, home to some of Europe's most advanced scientific research and mystical traditions. The city had managed to maintain a degree of independence from German influence, creating a temporary haven for intellectuals and refugees from throughout Central Europe. Victor spent several months in Budapest, absorbing everything he could learn about both modern science and ancient magic. The city's unique position at the crossroads of Eastern and Western Europe had made it a meeting place for traditions that were rarely found together elsewhere, creating opportunities for the kind of synthesis between science and mysticism that would become Victor's specialty in later years. The University of Budapest's physics department was among the most advanced in Europe, with professors who had studied under some of the giants of modern science and laboratories equipped with the latest experimental apparatus. Victor audited lectures whenever possible, engaging with concepts that pushed the boundaries of human understanding about the nature of reality itself. His questions were often more sophisticated than those of graduate students, and his insights frequently surprised even the most experienced faculty members. But it was in the city's older, more traditional institutions that Victor found the knowledge that would prove most crucial to his future development. Budapest had long been a center for the study of folklore and mysticism, with libraries that contained texts dating back to the medieval period, and scholars who maintained living connections to ancient traditions of magic and supernatural learning. Victor's approach to these mystical studies was characteristically systematic and analytical, as he sought to understand supernatural phenomena according to the same principles of investigation and experimentation that governed his scientific research. This methodology was not always welcomed by traditional practitioners, who often viewed his questions and theories as presumptuous or dangerous, but it allowed him to make connections and discoveries that purely intuitive approaches might have missed. The combination of advanced scientific training and mystical knowledge that Victor acquired during his time in Budapest created a unique intellectual foundation that would distinguish him from every other genius of his generation. Where most brilliant minds specialized in either rational or supernatural approaches to understanding reality, Victor was developing the ability to work effectively in both realms and to see connections between them that others missed entirely. It was during this period that Victor first began to understand the true scope of the supernatural forces that had shaped his family's history. His mother's texts, which he had carried with him from the mountain camps, took on new meaning when studied in the context of Budapest's extensive mystical libraries. The bargains that Cynthia von Doom had made with Mephisto were revealed to be part of a much larger pattern of supernatural contracts and obligations that had been accumulating for generations. This knowledge was both liberating and terrifying, as Victor realized that his own abilities and opportunities might be part of the price that would eventually have to be paid for his mother's protection of their people. The debt that Mephisto held over the Von Doom family was more complex and more dangerous than Victor had previously understood, involving not just individual souls but the very essence of power and knowledge that had been passed down through their bloodline. The realization that his own genius might be supernatural in origin rather than simply natural talent was a profound shock to Victor's sense of identity and self-worth. He had always taken pride in his intellectual achievements, viewing them as evidence of his inherent superiority and his right to leadership over others. The possibility that these abilities were borrowed rather than earned challenged his fundamental assumptions about himself and his destiny. But rather than being discouraged by this revelation, Victor responded with characteristic determination and ambition. If his powers were indeed supernatural in origin, then he would master the supernatural realm as thoroughly as he had mastered the scientific one. If there were prices to be paid for the knowledge and abilities he possessed, then he would acquire sufficient power to renegotiate or escape those obligations entirely. This decision to actively pursue mystical mastery alongside his scientific studies represented a crucial turning point in Victor's development, as it committed him to a path that would eventually make him one of the most dangerous individuals in the Marvel Universe. The combination of technological genius and supernatural power that he was developing would give him capabilities that few could match or counter, while also corrupting his moral judgment in ways that he didn't yet fully understand. The outbreak of war in September 1939 made it clear that Victor's education in Europe would have to be cut short sooner than he had hoped. The advancing German army was bringing with it policies that would make his continued presence in Budapest both dangerous and impossible. The systematic persecution of Romani people was intensifying throughout Nazi-occupied territory, and Victor's combination of intellectual prominence and ethnic heritage made him a particularly attractive target for the regime's racial ideology. The process of escaping from war-torn Europe proved to be almost as educationally valuable as Victor's formal studies, as it required him to demonstrate practical applications of both his scientific knowledge and his developing mystical abilities. The journey from Budapest to New York would take him through a dozen different countries, often just ahead of advancing armies or occupation forces, and would test every aspect of his intelligence, determination, and survival instincts. Victor's first challenge was obtaining the necessary documentation to travel legally, as his original papers had been issued by authorities that no longer existed or were no longer recognized by the rapidly changing political situation. This problem required him to master the arts of forgery and bureaucratic manipulation, skills that would prove useful in many future endeavors, but that also represented his first serious steps into the world of illegal and morally questionable activities. The network of contacts and safe houses that Victor used during his escape was composed largely of other intellectuals and refugees who were fleeing the Nazi advance, creating a community of displaced persons who shared both common dangers and common hopes for the future. These relationships exposed Victor to a broader range of human experience than his relatively sheltered childhood had provided, while also demonstrating the ways that extraordinary circumstances could bring out both the best and worst aspects of human nature. Some of the people Victor encountered during his journey were genuinely heroic, risking their lives to help strangers escape persecution and death. Others were opportunistic and exploitative, using the desperation of refugees to extract payment or favors that they would never have dared to demand under normal circumstances. These experiences taught Victor valuable lessons about human psychology and motivation that would influence his approach to leadership and manipulation for the rest of his life. The technical challenges of traveling across war-torn Europe also provided opportunities for Victor to develop and test various inventions and innovations that would later become important elements of his technological arsenal. The need for reliable communication devices, portable energy sources, and defensive equipment pushed him to find practical applications for theories that had previously been purely academic, while the resource constraints imposed by his refugee status forced him to learn efficiency and adaptability. One of the most significant developments during this period was Victor's first successful integration of scientific and mystical principles in a single device, as he created a communication system that used both electromagnetic and supernatural methods to maintain contact with allies across vast distances. The device was crude by the standards he would later achieve, but it represented a crucial breakthrough in his understanding of how different types of power could be combined and amplified. The psychological toll of constant danger and uncertainty during the escape from Europe was considerable, as Victor was forced to live with the knowledge that discovery could mean imprisonment, torture, or death. This stress contributed to the development of the paranoid and controlling personality traits that would later make him such a formidable opponent, as he learned to trust no one completely and to always maintain multiple backup plans for every situation. Victor's interactions with various resistance groups and underground networks during his journey provided him with his first practical education in the arts of conspiracy, sabotage, and guerrilla warfare. These skills would prove invaluable in his later campaigns for power, but they also exposed him to levels of violence and moral compromise that accelerated the erosion of his ethical boundaries and his willingness to consider the human costs of his actions. The months spent traveling through occupied territory also gave Victor extensive opportunities to observe the Nazi war machine in operation, from its impressive technological capabilities to its systematic methods of oppression and control. This first-hand exposure to totalitarianism provided him with both positive and negative lessons about the exercise of absolute power, showing him techniques that were effective while also demonstrating the ultimate unsustainability of systems based purely on fear and violence. By the time Victor finally reached the relative safety of neutral Switzerland, he had been fundamentally changed by his experiences during the escape from occupied Europe. The idealistic young man who had left the mountain camps with dreams of using his education to protect his people had been replaced by a harder, more cynical individual who understood that survival often required the willingness to make moral compromises and to use whatever methods were necessary to achieve important goals. The weeks spent in Swiss refugee camps waiting for American visa approval provided Victor with additional opportunities to study and plan, as the enforced inactivity gave him time to consolidate the knowledge he had gained during his travels and to begin developing more systematic approaches to the challenges he expected to face in the future. The camp libraries, while limited, contained works by some of the great strategic thinkers of history, and Victor absorbed their insights about power, leadership, and the art of warfare with characteristic intensity. It was during this period of waiting and preparation that Victor first began to envision the kind of nation he wanted to create for his people, drawing on everything he had learned about political organization, technological development, and social control during his journey across Europe. The plans he developed were ambitious and sophisticated, incorporating lessons from both successful and failed states throughout history, while also taking advantage of his unique combination of scientific and mystical knowledge. The vision that emerged from these months of planning was both inspiring and troubling, as it promised unprecedented prosperity and security for Victor's subjects while also requiring them to surrender many of the freedoms and rights that democratic societies considered essential. Victor's experiences as a refugee had convinced him that such sacrifices were not only acceptable but necessary, as individual liberty was meaningless if it could not be protected from external threats and internal chaos. When Victor's American visa was finally approved and he boarded the ship that would carry him across the Atlantic, he was no longer simply a brilliant young man seeking education and opportunity. He had become a strategic thinker with clear goals, sophisticated methods, and the moral flexibility necessary to pursue those goals regardless of the obstacles or opposition he might encounter. The foundation had been laid for the transformation that would eventually create Dr. Doom. Victor's first sight of the New York skyline in February 1940 was a moment of profound revelation that would influence his worldview for decades to come. The towering buildings and bustling energy of America's greatest city represented possibilities that simply didn't exist in the war-torn Europe he had fled. But they also demonstrated the kind of concentrated power and advanced organization that he hoped to create in his own future kingdom. The Statue of Liberty, with its promise of freedom and opportunity for the tired and poor and huddled masses, spoke directly to Victor's own experience as a refugee seeking a new life in a foreign land. But even as he was moved by the symbolism and the hope it represented, Victor was already thinking about how such ideals could be implemented more effectively through rational planning and enlightened leadership, rather than through the chaotic and inefficient processes of democratic governance, or Suring tu Plan. The initial weeks in New York were both exhilarating and overwhelming, as Victor struggled to adapt to the pace and complexity of American urban life, while also navigating the bureaucratic requirements necessary to establish his legal residency and academic enrollment. The city's diversity and energy provided daily reminders of human potential and achievement, but also revealed the persistent problems of inequality, crime, and social dysfunction that seemed to plague even the most prosperous democratic societies. Victor's first apartment was a small, cramped space in a neighborhood populated largely by other recent immigrants, where he could hear a dozen different languages spoken on any given day and where the dreams and struggles of people from around the world created a constant background of hope and desperation. This environment provided him with invaluable insights into the immigrant experience and the challenges faced by people trying to build new lives in unfamiliar circumstances. The contrast between his modest living conditions and the obvious wealth and luxury displayed in other parts of the city reinforced Victor's growing conviction that merit and intelligence were poorly rewarded by democratic market systems, while inherited privilege and social connections provided advantages that had nothing to do with actual capability or moral worth. These observations would later influence his development of Latvian social and economic policies that prioritized competence and contribution over background and wealth. Victor's enrollment at the small upstate college that had offered him a scholarship was both an opportunity and a profound disappointment, as the institution's resources and academic standards were far below what he had hoped for and expected. The professors were competent but not exceptional. The laboratories were adequate but not cutting edge, and the student body was largely composed of individuals whose intellectual capabilities and ambitions were nowhere near Victor's level. This mismatch between Victor's abilities and the educational opportunities available to him created frustrations that would influence his personality and his approach to collaboration for the rest of his life. He quickly learned that his superior intelligence and knowledge made it difficult for him to relate to his professors and classmates as equals, while their inability to understand or appreciate his insights made him increasingly isolated and contemptuous of their limitations. The social aspects of American college life were particularly challenging for Victor, whose background and experiences were so different from those of his fellow students that meaningful friendships seemed almost impossible to develop. His classmates had grown up in relative safety and prosperity, with little understanding of the political upheavals and personal tragedies that had shaped Victor's worldview, while his intellectual intensity and single-minded focus on his studies made him seem aloof and arrogant to those who sought more casual relationships. Horsers lituen teen punt gont. Su and dol elpen tor mort room and tools punt toad p. Victor's professors were initially impressed by his knowledge and abilities, recognizing that they were dealing with an exceptionally gifted student whose understanding of advanced concepts often exceeded their own. However, they soon became concerned about his attitude and his tendency to question established authorities and traditional methodologies, particularly when his challenges were based on theoretical frameworks that they couldn't fully understand or evaluate. The academic work itself was almost insultingly easy for someone of Victor's capabilities, as the pace of instruction was designed for students who needed time to absorb and integrate new concepts rather than for someone who could master entire fields of study in a matter of weeks. This forced Victor to seek additional challenges and opportunities outside the formal curriculum, leading him to conduct independent research projects that were far more advanced than anything the college was equipped to supervise or support. It was during his independent research that Victor first began to develop the theoretical frameworks that would eventually enable him to create some of his most impressive technological innovations. Working with limited resources and equipment, he was forced to rely primarily on mathematical analysis and conceptual modeling, skills that would prove invaluable when he later gained access to more sophisticated laboratories and manufacturing facilities. The isolation and frustration of his college years also contributed to the development of Victor's authoritarian personality traits, as he became increasingly convinced that his intellectual superiority gave him both the right and the responsibility to make important decisions for others who lacked the knowledge or wisdom to choose correctly for themselves. This conviction would later justify his assumption of absolute power over Latveria and his various attempts to extend his influence over other nations and peoples. Horos antam diet, wunderforce, ors, all sit. Victor's first encounter with discrimination based on his foreign background and accent came as a shock to someone who had expected American society to be more meritocratic and open than the European systems he had fled. While the prejudice he faced was generally less systematic and violent than what he had experienced under Nazi occupation, it was still painful and demoralizing to discover that even in the land of opportunity, success depended partly on factors beyond individual control or merit. These experiences with American prejudice and social hierarchy reinforced Victor's growing cynicism about democratic ideals and his conviction that enlightened authoritarianism might be superior to systems that allowed ignorance and bias to influence important decisions. If even educated Americans could be swayed by superficial characteristics like accent and appearance, how could they be trusted to make rational choices about complex political and social issues? The financial pressures of his scholarship and living expenses forced Victor to take part-time jobs that were far below his intellectual capabilities, working as a tutor, translator, and laboratory assistant for professors who often knew less about their subjects than he did. These positions provided additional income and practical experience, but they also exposed him to the inefficiencies and petty politics that seem to characterize American academic and professional life. Victor's work as a tutor was particularly revealing, as it gave him extensive opportunities to observe how other students learned and how their intellectual development was influenced by their backgrounds, motivations, and expectations. He became skilled at identifying each student's strengths and weaknesses and at developing teaching methods that could help them achieve their potential, but he also became increasingly frustrated with those who seemed unwilling or unable to take advantage of the opportunities they were given. The translation work that Victor did for various professors and researchers provided him with access to foreign scientific and philosophical texts that might otherwise have been unavailable to him, while also keeping him connected to the European intellectual traditions that had shaped his early education. This work also demonstrated his exceptional linguistic abilities and his talent for bridging cultural and conceptual gaps between different academic traditions. As Victor progressed through his undergraduate studies, his reputation as both a brilliant student and a difficult personality began to spread throughout the small academic community. His professors recognized his exceptional abilities, but were troubled by his arrogance and his apparent lack of respect for collaborative processes and institutional traditions. His fellow students admired his intelligence but were put off by his condescending attitude and his unwillingness to form normal social relationships. The tension between Victor's obvious intellectual gifts and his problematic personality traits created dilemmas for faculty members who were trying to decide how to handle his academic career and future prospects. Some argued that his genius justified overlooking his character flaws and that special accommodations should be made to help him achieve his potential. Others contended that his attitude problems would make him unsuitable for most professional positions regardless of his technical abilities. These debates about Victor's future were complicated by the lack of clear precedents for dealing with students whose intellectual capabilities were so far above normal ranges, particularly when those capabilities were combined with personality traits that made collaboration and mentorship difficult. The college's administrators found themselves trying to balance their desire to nurture exceptional talent with their responsibility to maintain institutional standards and community harmony. Victor himself was largely unaware of these behind-the-scenes discussions about his future, as his focus remained intensely concentrated on his studies and his independent research projects. He was developing theoretical frameworks and experimental techniques that would have impressed graduate students at much more prestigious institutions, while also beginning to see practical applications for the mystical knowledge that he had inherited from his mother's traditions. The integration of scientific and mystical approaches to understanding reality was becoming the central theme of Victor's intellectual development, as he recognized that conventional science alone was insufficient to explain or control many of the phenomena that he had observed during his journey from Europe. The combination of rational analysis and supernatural insight that he was developing would eventually become one of his greatest strengths, but it also set him apart from other scientists and made his work difficult to evaluate according to traditional academic standards. It was during his third year of undergraduate study that Victor first encountered the name Reed Richards in a professional context, as he came across several theoretical papers published by a fellow undergraduate who was attending a much more prestigious institution. Victor's initial reaction to Richards' work was a mixture of intellectual excitement and personal irritation, as he recognized both the sophistication of the research and what he perceived as missed opportunities and theoretical limitations. The papers that Richards had published dealt with advanced concepts in dimensional physics and electromagnetic theory, fields that were directly relevant to Victor's own research interests and theoretical investigations. The quality of the work was undeniably high, demonstrating a level of mathematical sophistication and conceptual insight that few undergraduate students could achieve. But Victor was convinced that he could identify flaws and oversights that the author had failed to recognize. Victor's decision to write detailed critiques of Richard's published work represented both a genuine intellectual exercise and an expression of his competitive instincts and need for recognition. He spent weeks analyzing each paper, developing alternative theoretical frameworks, and crafting responses that would demonstrate his own superior understanding of the underlying principles and their implications. The critiques that Victor produced were brilliant and insightful, revealing genuine problems with some of Richard's assumptions and methodologies while also proposing innovative solutions and alternative approaches. However, the tone of these critiques was condescending and dismissive, reflecting Victor's conviction that he was intellectually superior to everyone around him, including his most accomplished peers. When Victor submitted his critiques to the same journals that had published Richard's original papers, the editors were faced with the unusual situation of evaluating highly sophisticated work from an undergraduate student at a relatively unknown institution. The technical quality of Victor's analysis was impressive, but his arrogant tone and his attacks on a well-regarded young researcher raised questions about his professional judgment and his suitability for academic discourse. The publication of Victor's critiques created a minor sensation in the small community of theoretical physicists who followed such specialized research, as the exchange between two undergraduate students demonstrated a level of sophistication that was rarely seen even among graduate students and professional researchers. Some observers were impressed by the high quality of both the original work and the critical response, while others were concerned about the personal animosity that seemed to underlie the intellectual disagreement. Reed Richards' response to Victor's critiques was characteristically measured and professional, acknowledging the validity of some points while defending his methodology and conclusions where appropriate. This diplomatic approach only served to increase Victor's irritation, as he interpreted Richard's courtesy as either false modesty or intellectual complacency rather than recognizing it as evidence of genuine professionalism and mature judgment. The exchange of papers and responses continued throughout Victor's remaining undergraduate years, gradually escalating in both technical sophistication and personal antagonism. Other academics began to follow the debate between the two young theorists, and Victor found himself gaining a reputation as both a brilliant innovator and a difficult personality whose promise might be limited by his character flaws. Victor's undergraduate thesis was a groundbreaking work that attempted to synthesize quantum mechanics, electromagnetic theory, and certain mystical principles that he had learned from his mother's texts and his own independent research. The resulting theoretical framework was far more advanced than any previous attempt to bridge the gap between science and magic, representing a genuine contribution to human knowledge that would influence his own work for decades to come. The thesis defense was a contentious affair that highlighted the tensions between Victor's undeniable intellectual achievements and his problematic approach to academic collaboration and professional relationships. Several committee members argued that his work was too speculative and too dependent on unverifiable mystical sources to meet the standards of scientific rigor expected in academic research, while others contended that his insights were so profound that traditional methodological concerns were secondary to the potential implications of his discoveries. The debate over Victor's thesis became a proxy war for larger questions about the nature of scientific inquiry and the role of intuition and speculation in theoretical research, with different faculty members taking positions that reflected their own philosophical approaches to knowledge and discovery. Victor himself was characteristically dismissive of his critics, arguing that their inability to understand his work was evidence of their own intellectual limitations rather than flaws in his methodology or presentation. Despite the controversy surrounding his thesis and his reputation for being difficult to work with, Victor graduated summa cum laude and was accepted into the graduate program at Empire State University, one of America's most prestigious institutions for advanced scientific research. This acceptance represented a significant step forward in his academic career, but it also brought him into direct contact with Reed Richards for the first time, as both young men had been admitted to the same doctoral program in theoretical physics. The transition from his small undergraduate college to the sophisticated research environment of Empire State University was both exciting and challenging for Victor, as he finally gained access to the kind of advanced facilities and intellectual resources that his abilities deserved. The laboratories were equipped with state-of-the-art instruments. The libraries contained the most recent research from around the world, and the faculty included some of the most distinguished scientists of their generation. However, the increased competition and higher expectations at ESU also created new pressures and challenges for Victor, as he was no longer automatically the most knowledgeable and capable student in every class or research group. The other graduate students were themselves exceptional individuals who had been selected from the best universities in the country, and many of them possessed combinations of intelligence, education, and social skills that made them formidable competitors for faculty attention and research opportunities. The first meeting between Victor von Doom and Reed Richards took place in September 1943, during a graduate seminar on advanced electromagnetic theory taught by Professor Nathaniel Richards, Reed's adoptive father and one of the world's leading experts in theoretical physics. Both young men were immediately aware of each other's reputations based on their previous exchange of published papers, and both were curious to finally encounter the rival whose work they had been studying and critiquing for the past several years. Reed Richards was everything that Victor had expected, and everything that he instinctively disliked about American privilege and social advantages. Richards was tall, athletic, and handsome, with the kind of easy confidence that came from a lifetime of success and encouragement rather than the hard-won self-assurance that Victor had developed through struggle and adversity. He was also undeniably brilliant, with an intuitive grasp of complex theoretical concepts that matched Victor's own analytical abilities while being expressed through a more collaborative and diplomatic personality. Victor, by contrast, was shorter and darker, with intense eyes and sharp features that reflected both his intelligence and his inner tensions and frustrations. His confidence was harder-edged than Richards, born from the need to prove himself repeatedly in hostile environments rather than from the assumption that recognition and respect were his natural due. Where Richards was diplomatic and collaborative, seeking to build on others' ideas and find common ground, Victor was direct and confrontational, believing that intellectual discourse should be a form of combat that revealed truth through the defeat of weaker ideas and inferior minds. The two men's different approaches to scientific research and academic collaboration quickly became apparent in their graduate coursework and laboratory work. Richards was methodical and careful, building his theories step by step through rigorous experimentation and peer review, always ensuring that each stage of his work was thoroughly tested and validated before moving on to the next level of complexity. His approach emphasized teamwork and open communication, sharing results and insights freely with other researchers in the expectation that collaborative efforts would produce better outcomes than individual competition. Victor's methodology was more intuitive and ambitious, as he was willing to make bold theoretical leaps based on incomplete data and unverified assumptions, often achieving correct conclusions through insights that he couldn't fully explain or justify according to conventional scientific standards. His approach emphasized individual brilliance and proprietary control over research results, as he believed that sharing important discoveries prematurely would allow lesser minds to steal credit for work they could never have achieved independently. It was during this period that Victor first began to understand the full scope of his intellectual gifts. He wasn't just unusually intelligent, he possessed a form of genius that allowed him to see connections and patterns that escaped even other brilliant minds. Mathematical principles that took professors years to master became clear to him in days. Scientific theories that were considered cutting-edge revealed their flaws and limitations under his analysis. Most remarkably, he began to see ways that science and magic could be combined to create possibilities that neither discipline could achieve alone. But Victor's time in Budapest also exposed him to the growing influence of Nazi ideology and the systematic persecution that was beginning to spread across Eastern Europe. He witnessed book burnings, watched Jewish professors dismissed from their positions, and saw Romani families like his own being rounded up and transported to unknown destinations. These experiences reinforced his belief that only power could protect the innocent and that those who possessed such power had an obligation to use it decisively. The outbreak of war in September 1939 made it clear that Victor's education in Europe would have to be cut short. The advancing German army was bringing with it policies that would make his continued presence in Budapest both dangerous and impossible. Using contacts he had made in the academic community, Victor began to explore possibilities for continuing his education in safer locations. The opportunity that would change his life came from an unexpected source: the American State Department's emergency visa program for European intellectuals fleeing Nazi persecution. Victor's academic achievements and his status as a member of a persecuted minority group made him eligible for one of the coveted immigration slots that would allow him to continue his education in the United States. The process of obtaining the necessary paperwork and travel documents was complicated by the chaos of the war, but Victor's intelligence and determination proved sufficient to navigate even the Byzantine bureaucracies of wartime Europe. He also demonstrated a talent for manipulation and persuasion that would serve him well in future endeavors, convincing officials and administrators to expedite his case through a combination of logical arguments and subtle psychological pressure. Wandery. The journey from Budapest to New York took 3 months and required Victor to travel through a dozen different countries, often just ahead of advancing German armies or Soviet occupation forces. He carried with him only what he could fit in a single suitcase: his mother's mystical texts, his father's medical instruments, and notebooks filled with his own theoretical work. Everything else from his previous life had to be left behind, abandoned in the desperate flight from a continent consumed by war. Victor's first sight of the New York skyline in February 1940 was a moment of profound revelation. The towering buildings and bustling energy of America's greatest city represented possibilities that simply didn't exist in the war-torn Europe he had fled. Here was a society where intelligence and ambition could be rewarded regardless of birth or background, where the resources existed to turn theoretical knowledge into practical power, where a brilliant young man with the right combination of skills and determination could reshape his own destiny. But America in 1940 was also a society struggling with its own prejudices and limitations. Victor quickly discovered that his European credentials meant little to American institutions, that his accent and background marked him as foreign and potentially suspect, and that the opportunities he had dreamed of would require him to prove himself all over again in an unfamiliar cultural context. The scholarship that had brought him to America was conditional and limited, providing just enough support to cover basic living expenses while he attended a small college in upstate New York. The institution was respectable but not prestigious, staffed by competent but not exceptional faculty, and equipped with laboratories that were adequate but not cutting edge. For someone of Victor's abilities and ambitions, it was simultaneously an opportunity and a profound disappointment. Victor threw himself into his American education with the same intensity he had brought to his studies in Europe, but he also began to chafe against the limitations of his situation. The pace of instruction was too slow for his rapidly developing mind. The level of theoretical sophistication was too elementary for his advanced understanding, and the social environment was too provincial for someone who had witnessed the collapse of empires and the birth of new world orders. His professors were initially impressed by Victor's knowledge and abilities, but they soon became concerned about his arrogance and his tendency to question established authorities. Victor had no patience for academic traditions or social niceties that stood in the way of intellectual progress, and he made little effort to hide his contempt for what he saw as the mediocrity of his instructors and fellow students. The combination of Victor's obvious brilliance and his equally obvious disdain for those around him created a complex dynamic that would follow him throughout his academic career. His professors recognized his exceptional abilities but were troubled by his attitude and his apparent lack of respect for the collaborative nature of scientific research. His fellow students admired his intelligence but were put off by his arrogance and his unwillingness to form normal social relationships. It was during his second year at the small upstate college that Victor first encountered the name that would become synonymous with his greatest rival and most enduring obsession. Reed Richards was a fellow undergraduate at a much more prestigious institution, but his theoretical work on dimensional physics had already begun to attract attention in academic circles. Victor obtained copies of Richards' published papers and was both impressed by their sophistication and irritated by what he saw as their author's failure to pursue the most promising theoretical implications. The intellectual rivalry that would define both men's careers began as a purely academic exercise, with Victor writing detailed critiques of Richards' work and submitting them to the same journals that had published the original papers. These critiques were brilliant and insightful, but they were also condescending and dismissive in tone, revealing Victor's conviction that he was intellectually superior to everyone around him, including his most accomplished peers. Richards' responses to Victor's critiques were polite and thoughtful, acknowledging the validity of some points while defending his methodology and conclusions where appropriate. This measured response only served to increase Victor's irritation, as he interpreted Richards' courtesy as either false modesty or intellectual complacency. Victor had grown up in a world where conflicts were resolved through direct confrontation and overwhelming force, and he found the genteel traditions of academic discourse both frustrating and ineffective. The exchange of papers and critiques continued throughout Victor's undergraduate career, gradually escalating in both sophistication and personal animosity. Other academics began to follow the debate between the two young theorists, and Victor found himself gaining a reputation as both a brilliant innovator and a difficult personality. This reputation would prove to be both an asset and a liability as he sought to advance his academic career. Victor's undergraduate thesis was a groundbreaking work that attempted to synthesize quantum mechanics, electromagnetic theory, and certain mystical principles that he had learned from his mother's texts. The resulting theoretical framework was far more advanced than any previous attempt to bridge the gap between science and magic. And it laid the foundation for many of the inventions and discoveries that would make Victor famous in later years. The thesis defense was a contentious affair, with Victor's committee torn between admiration for his intellectual achievement and concern about his theoretical methodology and his personal conduct. Several professors argued that Victor's work was too speculative and too dependent on unverifiable mystical sources to meet the standards of scientific rigor expected in academic research. Others contended that his insights were so profound that traditional methodological concerns were secondary to the potential implications of his discoveries. The debate over Victor's thesis became a proxy war for larger questions about the nature of scientific inquiry and the role of intuition and speculation in theoretical research. Victor himself was characteristically dismissive of his critics, arguing that their inability to understand his work was evidence of their own intellectual limitations rather than flaws in his methodology. This attitude further strained his relationships with faculty members who might otherwise have supported his academic career. Despite the controversy surrounding his thesis, Victor graduated summa cum laude and was accepted into the graduate program at Empire State University, one of America's most prestigious institutions for advanced scientific research. The move to ESU represented a significant step forward in Victor's academic career, but it also brought him into direct contact with Reed Richards for the first time, as both young men had been accepted into the same doctoral program in theoretical physics. The first meeting between Victor Von Doom and Reed Richards took place in September 1943 in a graduate seminar on advanced electromagnetic theory. Both men were immediately aware of each other's reputations, and both were curious to finally encounter the rival whose work they had been critiquing for the past 2 years. The meeting was cordial but tense, with each man taking the measure of the other while maintaining the facade of academic collegiality. Reed Richards was everything that Victor had expected and everything that he instinctively disliked. Richards was tall, athletic, and handsome, with the kind of easy confidence that came from a lifetime of privilege and success. He was also undeniably brilliant, with an intuitive grasp of complex theoretical concepts that matched Victor's own abilities. Most irritatingly, Richards seemed genuinely modest about his achievements, crediting his successes to hard work and collaboration rather than claiming them as evidence of his inherent superiority. Victor, by contrast, was shorter and darker, with intense eyes and sharp features that reflected both his intelligence and his inattentions. His confidence was harder-edged than Richard's, born from struggle and adversity rather than privilege and encouragement. All, så hånfikte mig, served norving to me team, to stored of to spring to me team. Where Richards was diplomatic and collaborative, Victor was direct and confrontational, believing that intellectual discourse should be a form of combat that revealed truth through the defeat of weaker ideas. The two men's different approaches to scientific research quickly became apparent in their graduate coursework. Richards was methodical and careful, building his theories step by step and submitting each stage to rigorous testing and peer review. Victor was more intuitive and ambitious, making bold theoretical leaps that often proved correct but were difficult to verify through conventional experimental methods. Their professors were fascinated by the contrast between the two students, each of whom represented a different model of scientific genius. Richards embodied the collaborative, institutional approach to research that had become the standard in American universities, while Victor represented the older tradition of the solitary genius whose insights transcended conventional wisdom and established methodology. The rivalry between Victor and Reed intensified throughout their first year of graduate study, as they competed for the attention of faculty members, research opportunities, and academic honors. Victor's superiority complex made it impossible for him to accept that Richards might be his intellectual equal, while Reed's genuine desire for friendship and collaboration was frustrated by Victor's hostility and competitiveness. The breaking point came during their second year, when both men were working on related aspects of dimensional theory under the supervision of Professor Nathaniel Richards, Reed's adoptive father and one of the world's leading experts in theoretical physics. Victor had developed a revolutionary approach to interdimensional travel that promised to make such journeys both safer and more efficient than any previously proposed method. The theoretical work was brilliant, representing a genuine breakthrough in humanity's understanding of the fundamental structure of reality. However, Victor's calculations contained a subtle but crucial error, one that would have catastrophic consequences if the theory were put into practical application. Reed Richards, reviewing Victor's work as part of a collaborative research project, identified the error and attempted to bring it to Victor's attention. Victor's reaction to Reed's critique was explosive and revealing. Rather than thanking his colleague for catching a potentially dangerous mistake, Victor interpreted the correction as a personal attack on his competence and reputation. He accused Reed of jealousy and sabotage, claiming that the supposed error was actually an advanced theoretical concept that Reed was too limited to understand. The confrontation between the two students became increasingly heated, with Victor's pride and paranoia overwhelming his scientific objectivity. He refused to acknowledge the possibility that he had made a mistake, instead constructing elaborate theories about how Reed and the other faculty members were conspiring against him out of fear of his superior abilities. Professor Richards attempted to mediate the dispute, arranging for independent experts to review Victor's calculations and provide objective assessments of their validity. The results were unanimous. Victor's work contained a fundamental error that would make his proposed dimensional portal extremely dangerous to operate. The energy feedback from such a device would be sufficient to cause severe injury or death to anyone in its immediate vicinity. The independent confirmation of Reed's critique should have ended the controversy, but Victor's psychology made it impossible for him to accept defeat or acknowledge error. Instead, he convinced himself that the entire academic establishment was biased against him, that his foreign background and unconventional methodology had made him a target for persecution by lesser minds who feared his revolutionary insights. This conviction led Victor to make the decision that would define the rest of his life. Rather than accepting the faculty's recommendation to revise his theoretical framework, he decided to prove his theories correct through direct experimentation. Working in secret, using laboratory facilities after hours and without proper supervision, Victor began construction of a dimensional portal based on his original flawed calculations. The construction of the device required Victor to demonstrate skills that went far beyond theoretical physics, as he had to machine precision components, wire complex electronic systems, and calibrate exotic energy sources. His mother's mystical teachings proved surprisingly relevant to the project, as certain aspects of dimensional manipulation seemed to operate according to principles that were more magical than scientific in nature. Victor's work on the portal consumed him completely, as he devoted almost every waking hour to perfecting the device that would vindicate his theories and prove his intellectual superiority over Reed Richards and the rest of the academic establishment. He became increasingly isolated from his fellow students and faculty members, spending his days in classes and his nights in the laboratory, driven by an obsession that was gradually consuming his sanity. Reed Richards, meanwhile, was growing increasingly concerned about Victor's behavior and his suspected unauthorized experiments. Reed had tried to maintain their friendship despite Victor's hostility, and he genuinely feared that his classmates' wounded pride was leading him toward dangerous and potentially fatal actions. Several times, Reed attempted to approach Victor directly, offering to collaborate on a revised version of the dimensional portal that would incorporate the necessary safety modifications. These offers of help only increased Victor's paranoia and resentment, as he interpreted Reed's concern as further evidence of a conspiracy to steal his work and claim credit for his discoveries. Victor's worldview had been shaped by a lifetime of persecution and betrayal, and he was psychologically incapable of accepting that Reed's motivations might be genuinely altruistic rather than self-serving. The night that Victor chose to test his dimensional portal was cold and stormy, with electrical activity in the atmosphere that should have warned him to postpone the experiment. But Victor's obsession had reached a point where external considerations were irrelevant to his decision-making. He had convinced himself that success was not just likely but inevitable, and that the vindication of his theories would justify any risks he might have to take. The activation of the portal went exactly as Reed Richards had predicted it would. The dimensional breach was successfully opened, providing a brief glimpse into the alternate realities that lay beyond normal space-time. But the energy feedback from the flawed calculations was immediate and devastating, creating an explosion that destroyed most of the laboratory and severely injured Victor himself. The explosion scarred Victor's face permanently, leaving him with disfiguring injuries that would require him to wear a mask for the rest of his life. But the physical damage was less significant than the psychological trauma of having his theories proven wrong in such a dramatic and painful fashion. Victor's entire identity had been built around his intellectual superiority, and the failure of his greatest theoretical work threatened to destroy his sense of self entirely. Reed Richards was among the first to reach the destroyed laboratory, and he found Victor unconscious and severely burned among the wreckage of the dimensional portal. Reed's immediate reaction was to call for medical help and to try to stabilize Victor's injuries until professional assistance could arrive. His concern for his rival's welfare was genuine and immediate, despite the personal animosity that had grown between them. But when Victor regained consciousness and saw Reed's face hovering over him, his damaged mind interpreted the scene in the worst possible light. Rather than recognizing Reed's presence as evidence of concern and friendship, Victor convinced himself that Reed had somehow sabotaged his experiment, that the explosion had been the result of deliberate interference rather than theoretical error. This delusion became the foundation for Victor's future obsession with Reed Richards, transforming their academic rivalry into a personal vendetta that would span decades and influence countless other lives. Victor's inability to accept responsibility for his own mistakes, combined with his need to find external explanations for his failures to create a psychological framework that would make peace between them impossible. The physical and emotional trauma of the explosion marked the end of Victor Von Doom's academic career and the beginning of his transformation into the man who would become known as Dr. Doom. The brilliant but arrogant graduate student was gone, replaced by a scarred and bitter exile whose genius would be turned toward darker purposes than the advancement of human knowledge. Victor's expulsion from Empire State University was swift and decisive, as the unauthorized experimentation and destruction of laboratory facilities represented serious violations of academic conduct and safety protocols. The administration made it clear that Victor would not be welcome to return, effectively ending his dreams of an academic career and forcing him to find alternative paths for the development and application of his remarkable abilities. The weeks following the explosion were among the darkest of Victor's life, as he struggled to come to terms with both his physical injuries and the collapse of his carefully constructed plans for the future. The scarring to his face was severe enough to require multiple surgeries, but Victor refused most medical treatment, claiming that the doctors were incompetent and that he could heal himself more effectively using his own combination of scientific knowledge and mystical techniques. This decision to reject conventional medical care was partly based on Victor's genuine expertise in both medicine and the healing arts, but it was also motivated by his growing paranoia and his inability to trust anyone who might be connected to the academic establishment that had, in his mind, betrayed and persecuted him. The result was that his facial injuries healed poorly, leaving him with permanent disfigurement that would require him to wear a mask whenever he appeared in public. The mask that Victor designed for himself was a masterpiece of both engineering and psychological intimidation, crafted from rare metals and incorporating advanced technological features that enhanced both his appearance and his capabilities. But more than just a practical necessity, the mask became a symbol of his transformation from Victor Von Doom, the ambitious graduate student, into Dr. Doom, the would-be conqueror of worlds. With his academic career in ruins and his appearance permanently altered, Victor began to plan his return to Europe and his ultimate goal of creating a nation where his people could live in safety and dignity. The knowledge and skills he had acquired during his years in America would be essential to this project, but he now understood that conventional approaches to power acquisition would be insufficient for his purposes. The journey back to Europe was complicated by the ongoing war, as the Atlantic crossing was dangerous and the continent itself was still largely controlled by Nazi forces or their allies. Victor was forced to take a circuitous route through South America and North Africa, using his intelligence and his growing mastery of both science and magic to navigate the complex web of wartime politics and bureaucratic obstacles. During this extended journey, Victor began to develop the philosophical framework that would guide his future actions as Dr. Doom. He concluded that democracy and international cooperation were inherently flawed systems that allowed the weak and mediocre to constrain the strong and brilliant. Only through absolute rule by those with superior intelligence and moral vision could humanity achieve its full potential and overcome the petty conflicts that had plagued it throughout history. This philosophy was a direct outgrowth of Victor's childhood experiences with persecution and injustice, combined with his academic frustrations and his growing megalomania. The noble goal of protecting his people had been gradually transformed into a grandiose vision of reshaping human civilization according to his own theories of optimal social organization. Victor's return to the Carpathian Mountains in late 1944 coincided with the final collapse of Nazi power in Eastern Europe and the advance of Soviet forces into the region. The political chaos of this transition period provided both opportunities and dangers for someone with Victor's skills and ambitions, as traditional power structures crumbled and new ones struggled to establish themselves. The Romani camps of Victor's childhood had survived the war largely intact, protected by the mystical shields that his mother had woven around them years earlier. But Cynthia's magical protections were beginning to weaken, and the community faced new threats from both Soviet occupation forces and local groups seeking to settle old scores in the anarchic conditions that followed the German retreat. Victor's return was greeted with a mixture of joy and apprehension by his father and the other community elders. They were relieved to see that he had survived his years in America, but they were troubled by the changes that were immediately apparent in his appearance and demeanor. The young man who had left them 5 years earlier had been arrogant and ambitious, but he had also been recognizably human in his emotions and motivations. The figure who returned was colder, more calculating, and seemingly driven by obsessions that his family and friends could not fully understand. Werner von Doom tried to reconnect with his son, hoping that the familiar surroundings and relationships of his childhood might restore some of Victor's lost humanity. But the gulf between them had grown too wide to bridge through simple paternal affection, and Victor's bitterness over his perceived failures and betrayals made it difficult for him to accept emotional support from anyone, even those who genuinely loved him. The reunion between father and son was further complicated by Victor's growing understanding of the mystical forces that had shaped his family's history. His years of study had given him the knowledge necessary to perceive the magical protections that surrounded the community, and he quickly realized that these defenses were the result of bargains that his mother had made with supernatural entities of questionable trustworthiness. Victor's investigation into his mother's mystical activities revealed the full extent of the debt that had been incurred on his behalf, and he began to understand that his own supernatural abilities and intellectual gifts might be part of the price that would eventually have to be paid. This knowledge only increased his determination to acquire sufficient power to renegotiate or escape the terms of agreements that he had never consented to make. The immediate priority, however, was the physical and political security of his people, as the mystical protections that had sheltered them during the war were clearly failing. Victor concluded that only conventional military and political power could provide lasting safety, and he began to develop plans for the conquest of the surrounding territory and the establishment of an independent nation-state. The first step in this ambitious project was the elimination of the remaining local power structures that might oppose his plans. The Baron who had once oppressed the Romani camps was long dead, but his castle and much of his former territory were now controlled by a Soviet garrison that had been left behind to maintain order during the transition to communist rule. Victor's assault on the Soviet garrison was his first major military operation, and it demonstrated both his strategic brilliance and his willingness to use whatever methods were necessary to achieve his goals. Rather than attempting a direct confrontation with superior numbers and firepower, Victor used a combination of technological superiority, mystical manipulation, and psychological warfare to turn the occupying forces against each other and ultimately drive them from the region. The weapons that Victor deployed in this campaign were the first practical applications of the theoretical work he had developed during his years in America, combined with mystical techniques that he had learned from his mother's texts and refined through his own experimentation. The result was a form of warfare that was unlike anything his opponents had ever encountered, blending advanced science with supernatural forces in ways that made conventional military responses inadequate. The success of Victor's campaign against the Soviet garrison established his reputation as a military leader and provided him with the territorial base necessary for the next phase of his plans. But it also attracted the attention of larger powers who were concerned about the emergence of an independent stronghold in a strategically important region of Eastern Europe. The years immediately following Victor's conquest of his ancestral homeland were devoted to the consolidation of his power and the construction of the infrastructure necessary to support an independent nation-state. He established his headquarters in the renovated castle that had once belonged to Baron von Ruthven, transforming it into a fortress that combined medieval architecture with advanced technology and mystical defenses. The castle that would become known throughout the world as Castle Doom was Victor's masterpiece of engineering and design, incorporating innovations that were decades ahead of their time and defensive systems that made it virtually impregnable to conventional attack. The structure served as both a symbol of Victor's power and a practical fortress from which he could govern his growing domain. Victor's rule over his newly conquered territory was characterized by a combination of benevolent paternalism and ruthless efficiency that reflected his complex motivations and psychological makeup. He genuinely cared about the welfare of his subjects, particularly the Romani people whose protection had been his original goal, but he also demanded absolute obedience and showed no mercy to those who opposed his will. The legal system that Victor established in his domain was based on his own theories of optimal social organization, emphasizing order, efficiency, and the supremacy of rational authority over traditional customs and democratic processes. Crime was virtually eliminated through a combination of advanced surveillance technology and harsh punishments for violators, while economic productivity was maximized through careful central planning and the application of Victor's scientific expertise to agricultural and industrial development. The success of Victor's domestic policies attracted refugees and immigrants from throughout Eastern Europe as people fleeing the chaos and oppression of the post-war period sought the stability and prosperity that his rule provided. This influx of new subjects strengthened Victor's power base, while also providing him with the human resources necessary for his more ambitious projects. But even as Victor was establishing himself as the unchallenged ruler of his small mountain kingdom, he was already planning for the expansion of his influence and the eventual achievement of his ultimate goals. The creation of a safe homeland for his people had been only the first step in a much larger project that would ultimately encompass the transformation of human civilization itself. The name Latveria was Victor's own creation, chosen to reflect both the historical identity of the region and his vision for its future role in world affairs. The choice of name was also a deliberate break with the past, symbolizing Victor's rejection of the traditional power structures and national boundaries that had failed to protect his people during their centuries of persecution. The early years of Latvian independence were marked by a series of diplomatic and military challenges as surrounding powers attempted to either absorb or eliminate Victor's fledgling nation. The Soviet Union was particularly concerned about the example that successful resistance to communist rule might provide to other satellite states, while Western powers were suspicious of Victor's methods and uncertain about his ultimate intentions. Victor's response to these external pressures was to accelerate the development of Latveria's military capabilities while also beginning the construction of the advanced technology and mystical weapons that would eventually make him one of the most feared individuals on Earth. The combination of scientific genius and supernatural power that he brought to these projects resulted in innovations that were far beyond anything that conventional military research could produce. The first public demonstration of Dr. Doom's capabilities came during a border conflict with a neighboring communist state that had been encouraged by Soviet advisors to test Latveria's defenses. Victor's response was swift and devastating, deploying weapons that seemed almost magical in their effectiveness and demonstrating a level of strategic thinking that completely outmaneuvered his opponents. The decisive victory in this conflict established Dr. Doom's international reputation and sent a clear message to other potential aggressors that Latveria was not a target for casual exploitation. But it also marked Victor's full transformation from ambitious exile to costumed dictator as he began to appear in public wearing the distinctive armor and mask that would become his trademark. The armor that Victor designed for himself was more than just protective equipment or dramatic costumes. It was a technological marvel that enhanced his already formidable abilities and provided him with capabilities that approached the supernatural. The suit incorporated advanced materials, sophisticated computer systems, and mystical elements that made it one of the most powerful tools ever created by human ingenuity. But perhaps more importantly, the armor served as a psychological barrier between Victor von Doom the man and Dr. Doom the public figure, allowing him to maintain some separation between his private self and the role he had chosen to play on the world stage. The mask hid not just his scarred features but also his remaining humanity, making it easier for him to make the difficult decisions that his position required. As Dr. Doom's reputation grew and his power expanded, he began to attract the attention of other individuals with extraordinary abilities, both those who might serve as useful allies and those who represented potential threats to his plans. The emergence of costumed heroes and villains in America was of particular interest to him, as these individuals possessed capabilities that could either aid or hinder his ultimate goals. The news that Reed Richards had acquired superhuman abilities and become the leader of a team called the Fantastic Four was received by Doctor Doom with a mixture of interest and satisfaction. Victor's old rival had finally achieved the kind of prominence that Victor had always believed was his own rightful destiny. But the circumstances of Reed's transformation also provided an opportunity for the settling of old scores and the resolution of conflicts that had been simmering for more than a decade. Doctor Doom's first encounter with the Fantastic Four was carefully planned and executed, designed to demonstrate his superiority over Reed Richards while also testing the capabilities of this new superhero team. The battle was as much psychological as physical, with Victor using his knowledge of Reed's personality and motivations to exploit weaknesses that went far beyond the merely tactical. The outcome of this first confrontation established the pattern that would define the relationship between Doctor Doom and the Fantastic Four for decades to come. Victor's superior planning and resources allowed him to achieve tactical victories and psychological advantages, but the hero's teamwork and determination prevented him from achieving the decisive triumph that his ego demanded. This dynamic of repeated conflict, without final resolution, was both frustrating and oddly satisfying for Doctor Doom, as it provided him with worthy opponents whose defeat would be meaningful, while also giving him opportunities to demonstrate his superiority in ways that less capable adversaries could not. The Fantastic Four became his perfect enemies, challenging enough to be interesting but not so powerful as to pose a genuine threat to his long-term plans. The establishment of Doctor Doom as one of the world's premier supervillains marked the beginning of a new phase in his career, as he expanded his activities beyond the borders of Latveria and began to pursue goals that were truly global in scope. The small mountain kingdom remained his base of operations and the source of his legitimacy, but his ambitions now encompassed nothing less than the reshaping of human civilization according to his vision of optimal organization. The decades that followed would see Doctor Doom involved in countless schemes and conflicts, some aimed at the acquisition of greater power, others designed to settle personal scores, and still others motivated by his genuine desire to improve the human condition through the application of superior intelligence and will. Throughout all of these adventures, he would remain true to the core beliefs and motivations that had been shaped by his tragic childhood and his traumatic experiences as a young man. The story of Doctor Doom is ultimately the story of how noble intentions can be corrupted by pride and how great intelligence can be undermined by emotional blindness. Victor Von Doom began his journey as a victim of injustice who genuinely wanted to protect the innocent and improve the world, but his methods and his psychology gradually transformed him into the very kind of tyrant he had originally opposed. Yet even at his worst, even when his actions caused suffering and his schemes threatened global catastrophe, Doctor Doom never entirely lost sight of his original goals or his fundamental beliefs about justice and protection of the weak. This internal contradiction between his noble aspirations and his tyrannical methods would define his character throughout his long career and make him one of the most complex and compelling figures in the Marvel Universe. As the 1960s dawned and the Silver Age of comics began in earnest, Doctor Doom had established himself as both the ruler of a small but strategically important nation and one of the world's most dangerous and unpredictable supervillains. His early confrontations with the Fantastic Four had demonstrated his formidable capabilities while also revealing the psychological obsessions that would drive many of his future schemes. The decade of the 60s was a time of tremendous social and political upheaval throughout the world, as traditional power structures were challenged by new ideologies and emerging technologies promised to reshape human civilization. Doctor Doom watched these developments with great interest, seeing in them both opportunities to advance his own goals and threats to the stability that he had worked so hard to create in Latveria. The Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union was of particular concern to Doom, as his small nation was strategically located between the two superpowers and could easily become a battleground in any escalation of their conflict. But rather than simply choosing sides, Doom pursued a policy of careful neutrality that allowed him to maintain his independence while also taking advantage of the resources and opportunities that the global conflict provided. Doom's approach to international diplomacy during this period was characteristically bold and unconventional, as he used his technological superiority and mystical abilities to punch far above his weight class in global affairs. Latveria's small size and limited resources should have made it a minor player in world politics, but Doom's genius and ruthlessness allowed his nation to exercise influence far beyond what its objective capabilities would suggest. The development of Latveria's scientific and technological infrastructure during the 60s was one of Doom's greatest achievements, as he transformed his backward mountain kingdom into one of the most advanced nations on Earth. The universities, research facilities, and manufacturing centers that he constructed rivaled those of much larger and richer countries, while his careful attention to education and training ensured that his subjects could take full advantage of the opportunities he provided. But Doom's domestic successes were overshadowed in the public mind by his increasingly frequent conflicts with various superhero teams and individual champions. His battles with the Fantastic Four had established him as Reed Richards' primary nemesis, but he also came into conflict with other heroes whose activities threatened his plans or whose principles conflicted with his methods. The pattern of these conflicts was remarkably consistent, with Doom's superior planning and resources allowing him to achieve initial advantages that were ultimately overcome by his opponent's teamwork, determination, and moral conviction. These defeats were frustrating for someone of Doom's ego and ambitions, but they also served important psychological functions by providing him with challenges that tested his abilities and validated his sense of his own importance. One of the most significant developments of this period was Doom's growing involvement with mystical and supernatural forces, as he sought to expand his power beyond the merely technological and scientific. His mother's legacy had given him some understanding of magical principles, but it was during the 60s that he began to seriously study and practice the arcane arts. Doom's approach to magic was characteristically systematic and scientific, as he attempted to understand supernatural forces according to the same principles of analysis and experimentation that he applied to conventional physics and engineering. This methodology was not always successful, as magic often operated according to rules that were fundamentally different from those governing the natural world, but it did allow him to achieve a level of mystical ability that complemented his technological prowess. The combination of science and magic that Doom mastered during this period made him uniquely dangerous among the world's supervillains, as few of his opponents were prepared to deal with threats that operated according to both conventional and supernatural principles. His armor incorporated mystical elements alongside advanced technology, while his strategic planning took into account both physical and metaphysical factors that other villains ignored. The most ambitious of Doom's schemes during the 60s was his attempt to harness the power of the cosmic entity known as the Silver Surfer, whom he first encountered during Galactus's assault on Earth. Doom recognized immediately that the Surfer's power cosmic represented a level of energy and capability that could potentially allow him to achieve all of his goals simultaneously, from the conquest of Earth to the resolution of his mother's supernatural bondage. The battle for control of the Silver Surfer became one of Doom's most desperate and revealing conflicts, as he was forced to confront not only the Surfer's overwhelming power but also the moral implications of his desire to enslave a being whose only crime was serving a master whose nature he could not change. The outcome of this conflict provided important insights into Doom's psychology and the limits of his willingness to compromise his principles for the sake of power. Doom's failure to permanently control the Silver Surfer was a significant setback to his plans, but it also taught him valuable lessons about the nature of cosmic-level power and the challenges involved in wielding forces that were beyond human scale and understanding. These lessons would prove crucial in his later encounters with other cosmic entities and his growing involvement in multiversal conflicts. As the 60s progressed and moved into the 70s, Doctor Doom's reputation and influence continued to grow, but so did the complexity of the challenges he faced and the sophistication of his opponents. The simple conflicts of his early career gradually gave way to more nuanced and morally ambiguous situations that tested not just his abilities but also his fundamental beliefs about justice, power, and responsibility. The emergence of other technologically advanced villains and the increasing involvement of government agencies in superhuman affairs created new complications for Doom's plans, as he was forced to compete for resources and opportunities with individuals who possessed capabilities similar to his own. This competition often led to alliances of convenience with other villains, though Doom's pride and paranoia made such partnerships inherently unstable. One of the most significant relationships of this period was Doom's complex dynamic with Namor the Submariner, another monarch whose royal status and tempestuous personality created both common ground and inevitable conflict. The two rulers shared certain philosophical perspectives about the responsibilities of leadership and the inadequacies of democratic governance, but their different priorities and methods made sustained cooperation difficult. The alliance between Doom and Namor was typical of the relationships that Doom formed with other powerful individuals during this period, potentially beneficial but ultimately limited by his inability to accept genuine equality with anyone. Doom's conviction that his intelligence and moral vision made him naturally superior to others made it impossible for him to form partnerships based on mutual respect and shared decision-making. This pattern of failed alliances and temporary partnerships characterized much of Doom's career during the 70s and 80s, as he repeatedly discovered that his personality and methods made him unsuitable for the kind of collaborative leadership that large-scale conquest would require. His subjects in Latveria accepted his absolute rule because they benefited from his protection and benevolence, but other powerful individuals were not willing to subordinate themselves to his vision and authority. The realization that his psychological limitations were hindering his strategic goals led Doom to begin a period of introspection and self-analysis that would gradually transform his approach to both personal relationships and global politics. This process was slow and often interrupted by external crises, but it represented the beginning of a maturation process that would eventually make him a more complex and morally ambiguous figure. The 1980s marked a significant evolution in Doctor Doom's character and methods as he began to move beyond simple conquest and world domination toward more sophisticated goals that took into account the genuine complexity of human nature and social organization. This shift was partly the result of his accumulated experiences and partly a response to changes in the world that made his earlier approaches less viable. The end of the Cold War and the emergence of new global challenges like terrorism, environmental degradation, and economic inequality created opportunities for Doom to demonstrate that his intelligence and resources could be used for genuinely beneficial purposes. His response to these challenges was characteristically bold and often effective, though his methods remained controversial and his motivations continued to be questioned by both allies and enemies. One of the most dramatic examples of this evolution was Doom's response to a global environmental crisis that threatened to cause widespread famine and social collapse. Rather than simply exploiting the situation for his own advantage, Doom used his technological capabilities and international connections to develop and implement solutions that saved millions of lives and demonstrated the potential benefits of enlightened authoritarianism. The success of this humanitarian intervention earned Doom unprecedented international recognition and grudging respect from some of his former enemies, but it also created new complications as various parties attempted to understand and respond to his apparently changing priorities. Some observers concluded that Doom was finally maturing into a genuinely benevolent leader, while others suspected that his altruism was simply a more sophisticated form of manipulation. The truth, as usual with Doctor Doom, was more complex than either interpretation suggested. His concern for human welfare was genuine and had always been a part of his motivation, but his methods and his ultimate goals remained fundamentally unchanged. He still believed that only superior intelligence and absolute authority could solve humanity's problems, and he was still determined to prove this belief through practical demonstration. The most significant development of this period was Doom's growing involvement in mystical affairs, particularly his ongoing attempts to resolve the supernatural situation that had claimed his mother's soul decades earlier. This personal quest became increasingly important to him as he aged and began to contemplate his own mortality and legacy. The search for his mother's soul led Doom into conflicts with some of the most powerful mystical entities in the Marvel Universe, including multiple confrontations with Mephisto himself. These battles were not just physical but also psychological and spiritual, as Doom was forced to confront the darker aspects of his own nature and the prices he had paid for his accumulation of power. The complexity of these mystical conflicts required Doom to develop new abilities and form new alliances, working with heroes and other figures whom he had previously considered enemies. The most notable of these partnerships was his collaboration with Doctor Strange, the Sorcerer Supreme, whose mystical expertise complemented Doom's technological prowess and whose moral perspective provided a counterbalance to Doom's more ruthless inclinations. The relationship between Doom and Strange was particularly significant because it represented one of the few occasions when Doom was willing to acknowledge another individual as his intellectual and ethical equal. Strange's mastery of the mystical arts commanded Doom's respect in a way that few other accomplishments could, while Strange's willingness to work with Doom despite their philosophical differences demonstrated a pragmatic approach to heroism that Doom could understand and appreciate. Lestrange's mastery of the mystical arts commanded Doom's respect in a way that few other accomplishments could, while Strange's willingness to work with Doom despite their philosophical differences demonstrated a pragmatic approach to heroism that Doom could understand and feel. And away. The culmination of Doom's quest to save his mother's soul came in a series of adventures that required him to traverse multiple dimensions, battle cosmic-level entities, and ultimately sacrifice much of his accumulated power in exchange for Cynthia Von Doom's freedom. The success of this mission was one of Doom's greatest personal victories, but it also marked a turning point in his character development as he began to understand the true costs of his lifelong pursuit of power. The reunion with his mother, even if only temporary, provided Doom with the kind of emotional closure that he had been seeking for decades. Cynthia's pride in her son's accomplishments was tempered by her sorrow over the prices he had paid to achieve them, and her gentle guidance helped him begin to see possibilities for redemption and positive change that his pride had previously obscured. As the 20th century drew to a close, Dr. Doom had evolved from a simple supervillain motivated by revenge and megalomania into a complex figure whose actions and motivations defied easy categorization. His rule over Latveria had brought genuine prosperity and security to his subjects, his technological innovations had advanced human knowledge and capability, and his occasional heroic actions had saved countless lives throughout the world. Yet Doom remained fundamentally unchanged in his core beliefs about the necessity of strong leadership and the inadequacy of democratic institutions. His benevolence was real but conditional, dependent on his subjects' continued acceptance of his authority and his own conviction that his methods were superior to all alternatives. This combination of genuine concern for human welfare and absolute refusal to compromise his authority made him one of the most morally ambiguous figures in the Marvel Universe. The new millennium brought new challenges and opportunities for Dr. Doom as global communications networks and emerging technologies created possibilities for influence and control that previous generations could never have imagined. Doom's early recognition of these developments and his systematic preparation for their implications gave him significant advantages over both his enemies and his potential allies. The rise of the internet and digital communications was of particular interest to Doom, as these technologies provided unprecedented opportunities for surveillance, manipulation, and control of information. His investment in cybernetic research and artificial intelligence development during this period positioned Latveria as a leader in the digital revolution, while also providing Doom with new tools for achieving his long-term goals. But the new century also brought new threats that challenged even Doom's formidable capabilities. Cosmic-level conflicts and multiversal crises became increasingly common and increasingly dangerous. These challenges required Doom to work with heroes and other figures whom he had traditionally opposed, leading to alliances and partnerships that would have been unthinkable in earlier decades. The most significant of these collaborations was Doom's involvement in various efforts to protect Earth from cosmic threats, where his combination of scientific genius, mystical knowledge, and strategic thinking made him an invaluable ally despite his problematic methods and motivations. These partnerships were often tense and difficult, but they demonstrated that Doom's primary loyalty was ultimately to humanity rather than to his own ego or ambitions. As Doom's reputation evolved from simple villainy towards something more complex and morally ambiguous, his relationships with other characters became more nuanced and interesting. His ongoing rivalry with Reed Richards remained central to his character, but it was increasingly balanced by moments of cooperation and even grudging respect when larger threats required them to work together. The development of Doom's relationship with Richards' children was particularly significant, as Franklin and Valeria Richards represented the kind of pure potential and innocence that reminded Doom of his own childhood dreams and aspirations. His protective attitude toward the children often put him at odds with their parents, but it also revealed aspects of his character that had been hidden for decades beneath layers of armor and arrogance. Doom's evolution as a character was not a simple progression from evil to good, but rather a gradual recognition of the complexity of moral choice and the limitations of absolute solutions to human problems. His fundamental beliefs about the necessity of strong leadership remained unchanged, but his understanding of what such leadership required became more sophisticated and more responsive to the actual needs of those he sought to protect. The 21st century also saw Doom grappling with questions of legacy and succession that had become increasingly urgent as he aged and began to contemplate his own mortality. The creation of Doombots and other technological extensions of his will represented attempts to ensure the continuation of his vision beyond his own lifetime, but they also raised questions about the nature of identity and consciousness that challenged his understanding of himself. The relationship between Doom and his various technological duplicates became a recurring theme in his later adventures, as he struggled to maintain control over creations that possessed his intelligence and memories but not necessarily his values or priorities. These conflicts forced him to confront fundamental questions about what made him unique and whether his vision for humanity could survive his own physical death. As the second decade of the 21st century progressed, Dr. Doom found himself increasingly involved in cosmic-level conflicts that threatened not just Earth but entire dimensions and realities. These challenges required him to expand his understanding of power and responsibility beyond the planetary scale, and to consider the implications of his actions across multiple universes and timelines. The most significant of these conflicts was his involvement in the events leading up to and during the collapse and reconstruction of the Marvel multiverse, where his scientific expertise and mystical knowledge made him one of the few individuals capable of understanding and potentially preventing the total destruction of reality itself. His role in these events would prove to be both heroic and controversial, as his methods and motivations remained characteristically complex and difficult to categorize. The multiversal crisis forced Doom to work more closely with Reed Richards than ever before, as both men recognized that their personal conflicts were insignificant compared to the threat of universal annihilation. The collaboration between these two brilliant but fundamentally different individuals produced solutions that neither could have achieved alone, while also providing opportunities for them to finally understand and partially resolve the psychological conflicts that had driven their rivalry for decades. The successful resolution of the multiversal crisis marked another turning point in Doom's character development, as he began to see himself not just as the ruler of Latveria or the conqueror of Earth, but as a guardian of reality itself whose responsibilities extended far beyond his original ambitions. This cosmic perspective didn't eliminate his ego or his authoritarian tendencies, but it did provide a framework for understanding his role in the larger scheme of existence. The period following the multiversal crisis saw Doom taking on increasingly heroic roles as he worked to protect Earth and humanity from threats that other heroes were inadequately equipped to handle. His assumption of the Iron Man identity during Tony Stark's absence was particularly significant, as it represented his first serious attempt to function as a traditional superhero while maintaining his core beliefs about leadership and authority. Doom's tenure as Iron Man was controversial but ultimately successful, as he proved capable of fulfilling the role's responsibilities while bringing his own unique perspective and capabilities to bear on the challenges he faced. The experience taught him valuable lessons about collaboration and teamwork that would influence his future relationships with other heroes and his approach to leadership in general. The evolution of Doctor Doom, from supervillain to anti-hero to occasional full hero, was not a simple linear progression, but rather a complex process of growth and self-discovery that reflected both his changing circumstances and his gradual maturation as a person. His fundamental beliefs about the necessity of strong leadership and the inadequacy of democratic institutions remained largely unchanged, but his understanding of how to implement these beliefs became more sophisticated and more responsive to the actual needs of those he sought to serve. The most recent phase of Doom's career has been characterized by his attempts to balance his traditional role as Latveria's absolute ruler with his growing recognition of his responsibilities as a global and cosmic protector. This balance is not always easy to maintain, as his authoritarian methods often conflict with the collaborative approaches preferred by other heroes, but his genuine commitment to protecting humanity has earned him a measure of trust and respect that would have seemed impossible in his earlier incarnations. Doom's relationship with the Fantastic Four has evolved similarly, moving from simple antagonism toward a complex dynamic that encompasses rivalry, cooperation, and even friendship depending on the circumstances they face. Reed Richards remains his most challenging opponent and his most valued intellectual equal, while Sue, Johnny, and Ben have each developed their own unique relationships with the man who was once their greatest enemy. The current status of Doctor Doom is that of a figure who defies easy categorization, neither purely heroic nor entirely villainous, but something more complex and morally ambiguous. His actions are guided by a genuine desire to protect and improve humanity, but his methods remain controversial, and his ultimate goals continue to involve the establishment of his own vision of optimal social organization. This moral complexity makes Doom one of the most interesting and enduring characters in the Marvel Universe, as readers and other characters are constantly challenged to reconsider their assumptions about good and evil, heroism and villainy, and the proper relationship between power and responsibility. The legacy of Dr. Victor Von Doom extends far beyond his individual actions and schemes, encompassing the broader questions that his character raises about leadership, justice, and the proper use of superior intelligence and capability. His story serves as a cautionary tale about how noble intentions can be corrupted by pride and how great power can be undermined by psychological blindness, while also demonstrating the possibility of redemption and growth even for those who have made terrible mistakes. Doom's influence on the Marvel Universe has been profound and lasting, as his technological innovations, mystical discoveries, and strategic insights have shaped the development of countless other characters and storylines. His rivalry with Reed Richards provided the foundation for some of the most compelling conflicts in comics history, while his complex relationships with heroes and villains alike have added depth and nuance to the moral landscape of the Marvel Universe. The nation of Latveria itself has become one of the most important locations in Marvel Comics, serving as both a model of what enlightened authoritarianism might achieve and a warning about the dangers of absolute power concentrated in the hands of a single individual. The prosperity and security that Doom has brought to his subjects are undeniable, but so are the costs in terms of personal freedom and democratic participation that such benefits require. The technological and mystical innovations that Doom has developed over the decades have had far-reaching implications for the entire Marvel Universe, as his discoveries have been adapted, stolen, and built upon by countless other characters. His contributions to fields ranging from robotics and artificial intelligence to dimensional physics and supernatural studies have advanced human knowledge and capability in ways that will continue to influence future generations. Perhaps most importantly, Doom's character has evolved in ways that reflect broader changes in how we understand leadership, authority, and the proper relationship between individuals and society. His journey from simple villain to complex anti-hero mirrors the growing sophistication of comic book storytelling and the medium's increasing willingness to explore morally ambiguous characters and situations. The philosophical questions that Doom's character raises remain as relevant today as they were when he first appeared in the early 1960s. In an age of increasing global challenges and decreasing confidence in traditional democratic institutions, his arguments about the necessity of strong leadership and rational planning have a troubling resonance that goes beyond simple entertainment. Yet Doom's story also demonstrates the dangers of believing that any individual, no matter how intelligent or well-intentioned, possesses the wisdom and moral authority necessary to make fundamental decisions for others without their consent. His benevolent dictatorship may be more efficient and effective than democratic governance, but it comes at the cost of human dignity and self-determination that many would consider unacceptable regardless of the practical benefits it might provide. The relationship between Doom and his subjects in Latveria remains one of the most interesting aspects of his character, as it represents a genuine attempt to create a society based on rational planning and enlightened leadership. The loyalty and prosperity of the Latverian people suggests that his methods are at least partially successful. But the absence of dissent and the lack of mechanisms for peaceful change raise questions about what happens when the benevolent dictator is no longer benevolent or no longer present. Doom's ongoing quest for redemption and his attempts to atone for past mistakes have added new dimensions to his character in recent years, as he has begun to acknowledge the harm that his actions have caused and to seek ways of making amends. This process of self-reflection and moral growth has been slow and often interrupted by external crises, but it represents a genuine evolution in his understanding of himself and his responsibilities. The mystical aspects of Doom's character have become increasingly important in recent storylines, as his connection to supernatural forces and his ongoing relationship with his mother's legacy continue to influence his decisions and actions. The successful rescue of Cynthia von Doom's soul was a major milestone in his personal development, but it also opened new questions about the nature of redemption and the possibility of escaping the consequences of past choices. Doom's mastery of both science and magic makes him unique among Marvel characters, as few others possess the knowledge and capability necessary to operate effectively in both realms. This combination of abilities has made him invaluable in cosmic-level conflicts where conventional approaches are inadequate, while also creating new opportunities for storytelling that explore the relationship between rational and mystical approaches to understanding reality. The armor that has been Doom's trademark for more than 60 years of comics history has evolved along with the character himself, becoming more sophisticated and more integrated with his personal identity over time. The suit is no longer just protective equipment or a symbol of authority, but an extension of Doom's will and consciousness that embodies his technological mastery and his psychological need for control and perfection. The visual design of Dr. Doom has remained remarkably consistent throughout his long history, with the iconic mask and cape serving as instantly recognizable symbols that have transcended the medium of comics to become part of popular culture more broadly. This consistency has helped to reinforce his status as one of the most important and enduring characters in the Marvel Universe, while also providing a stable foundation for the exploration of his evolving personality and motivations. Doom's relationships with other villains have been consistently complicated by his pride and his conviction of his own superiority, making him a difficult ally and an unpredictable enemy. His alliances are typically temporary and focused on specific goals, as his inability to accept subordinate roles or share authority makes long-term partnerships nearly impossible to maintain. The contrast between Doom's public persona as a dictator and conqueror and his private moments of doubt and vulnerability has provided some of the most compelling character development in his long history. The rare occasions when his armor is removed or his mask is set aside reveal a man who is still struggling with the same fears and insecurities that drove him to seek power in the first place. Doom's intellectual rivalry with Reed Richards remains the defining relationship of his character, as it represents both his greatest source of motivation and his most significant psychological blind spot. The competition between these two brilliant men has driven both of them to achievements that neither could have reached alone, while also creating conflicts that have threatened the lives of countless innocent people. The evolution of this rivalry from simple antagonism toward grudging respect and occasional cooperation has been one of the most interesting aspects of both characters' development over the decades. Their ability to work together when faced with threats that transcend their personal conflicts demonstrates the maturity that both men have gained through experience, while their continued competitiveness shows that some aspects of their relationship will never entirely change. Doom's role as a father figure to various characters, particularly Reed and Sue's children, has revealed aspects of his personality that were previously hidden beneath layers of arrogance and authoritarianism. His genuine affection for Franklin and Valeria Richards, combined with his protective instincts toward other young people with extraordinary abilities, suggests that his desire to nurture and guide the next generation may be one of his most authentic motivations. The question of Doom's ultimate legacy remains open, as his character continues to evolve and his story continues to be told. Whether he will be remembered primarily as a villain who occasionally did good, or as a hero whose methods were questionable, depends largely on the choices he makes in future stories and the ultimate resolution of his character arc. The influence of Dr. Doom on comic book storytelling extends far beyond his own adventures, as his complex morality and sophisticated motivations have helped to establish new standards for villain characterization throughout the medium. The idea that antagonists could be sympathetic, even admirable in some respects, while still remaining fundamentally opposed to the heroes has become a common element in modern comics, largely due to the precedent that Doom established. The political and social themes that Doom's character explores have remained relevant throughout the decades since his creation, as questions about the proper balance between security and freedom, efficiency and democracy, and individual brilliance and collective wisdom continue to challenge societies around the world. His story serves as an ongoing thought experiment about what might happen if the most intelligent and capable individuals were given unlimited power to implement their vision of an ideal society. As we consider the complete story of Dr. Doom, from his tragic childhood in war-torn Europe to his current status as one of the most complex and morally ambiguous characters in comics, we see a figure who embodies both the best and worst aspects of human ambition and intelligence. His genuine desire to protect and improve humanity is matched by his arrogance and his conviction that only he possesses the wisdom necessary to guide the world toward a better future. The tragedy of Victor Von Doom is not that he became evil, but that his noble intentions were corrupted by pride and his great gifts were undermined by psychological blindness. The hope for his redemption lies not in abandoning his core beliefs about the necessity of strong leadership, but in learning to apply those beliefs with greater wisdom, humility, and respect for the autonomy and dignity of others. The story of Dr. Doom is ultimately a story about power and responsibility, about the prices we pay for our ambitions and the possibilities for redemption that exist even after we have made terrible mistakes. It is a story that reminds us that heroism and villainy are not fixed categories but rather choices that we make every day, and that even the most brilliant and capable among us are capable of both great good and great evil. As you drift off to sleep, Let yourself dream not just of iron masks and mystical powers, but of the deeper questions that Victor Von Doom's story raises about leadership, justice, and the proper use of intelligence and capability in service of others. Dream of a world where brilliant minds work together for the common good, where strength is used to protect rather than dominate, and where the lessons learned from past mistakes guide us toward a more just and peaceful future. Dream of the mountains of Latveria, where a small boy once swore to protect those he loved, and where that same boy, now grown into a complex and powerful man, continues to struggle with the implications of that childhood promise. Dream of Castle Doom not as a fortress of tyranny, but as a symbol of the human desire to create order and safety in a chaotic and dangerous world. Dream of the possibility that even the darkest paths can eventually lead toward light, that even the most twisted motivations can be straightened through wisdom and experience, and that redemption is always possible for those who are willing to acknowledge their mistakes and work to make amends for them. The story of Dr. Doom is far from over, as his character continues to evolve and grow with each new adventure and each new challenge he faces. But the foundations of his personality and the core themes of his story will remain constant. The tension between power and responsibility, the dangers of pride and isolation, and the eternal human struggle to balance our noble aspirations with our flawed nature. In Victor Von Doom, we see reflected both our greatest potentials and our darkest possibilities, a reminder that intelligence without wisdom is dangerous, that power without compassion is tyranny, and that even the best intentions can lead to terrible consequences if they are not tempered by humility and guided by genuine love for others. Rest now and dream of fantastic possibilities, secure in the knowledge that somewhere in the Marvel universe, Dr. Doom continues his complex journey from darkness toward light, from isolation toward connection, and from the arrogance of youth toward the wisdom that comes only through experience, suffering, and the gradual understanding of what it truly means to serve others rather than oneself. The armor may be cold, and the mask may hide his face, but beneath the metal and behind the legends, Victor Von Doom remains fundamentally human, struggling with the same hopes and fears that drive us all, seeking the same peace and purpose that every soul desires, and learning, slowly but surely, that true power comes not from dominating others, but from inspiring them to become the best versions of themselves. Sweet dreams, true believers, and may your own journeys toward wisdom and redemption be gentler and less costly than the path that transformed a frightened child in the mountains of Latveria into the most complex and compelling figure in all of comics. The future remains unwritten, full of possibilities both dark and bright, and it is up to all of us to choose which of those possibilities we will help to make real. Sleep well and dream of a tomorrow where intelligence serves compassion, where strength protects the weak, and where even the most scarred and bitter among us can find their way home to the light that still burns within their hearts, no matter how deeply it may be buried beneath years of pain and pride and the terrible weight of choices that cannot be undone, but can perhaps finally be forgiven.